Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. This will be our sixth show. He comes to us from the UK. His name is Tim Tate, last name Tate. And if you're watching this on Rumble, Rockfin, or X, you will see the cover of his new book. Full title of the new book is To Catch a Spy: How the Spycatcher Affair Brought MI5 in from the Cold. I'm old enough to remember this story. It was big news internationally. It's really about this book that was published by Peter Maurice Wright, or attempted to publish, eventually published, titled Spycatcher, and it was about his memoirs. But Tim and I have done a lot of other shows. I recommend people go back and check those out. One is Hitler's Secret Army: A Hidden History of Spies, Saboteurs, and Traitors in World War II. We also did one, The Murder of Childhood: Inside the Mind of One of Britain's Most Notorious Child Murderers. The other is, I think, our most recent, which is Spy Was Left Out in the Cold: The Secret History of Agent Golanowski. We also did one, The Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy: Crime, Conspiracy, and Cover-Up, a new investigation, so check that out. And then the documentary Dirty Little Secrets about German warfare. He's not in Korea. He's not just an author. He's done many 80 documentary films for British and several international networks, and he's written for national and regional newspapers. So he definitely wears a lot of different hats. For people here in the States who are familiar with the Franklin scandal, he also directed The Conspiracy of Silence, which was never, I think, formally shown on American TV, although clips of it bounced around the internet and they seem to have all been censored. As far as I know, maybe there's somewhere else. Maybe somebody knows about that. But it's an interesting backstory. But again, we're going to talk about his new book. It's titled To Catch a Spy: How the Spycatcher Affair Brought MI5 in from the Cold. So, Tim Tate, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
For people who hadn't heard our earlier discussions or topics or may not be familiar with you, maybe you can write about your interest in espionage in general, your earlier books, and then what led you up to researching and writing To Catch a Spy.
My interest is not so much in espionage itself, which is, let's be honest, it's a fairly grubby, mundane business, but it's in the intersection between politics and espionage, how governments control or don't control their spy services. And I'd been working, as you've mentioned, on previous books about MI5 and its involvement with attempts to stop Nazi traitors in Britain during World War II, and then on the Golanowski story. For new readers, start here. Mikhail Golanowski was probably the most important asset the West had inside Soviet bloc intelligence in the early years of the Cold War, and then he defected and then went mad. And his story intersected with MI5 and with Peter Wright, who was an MI5 spycatcher. He was MI5's most senior counterintelligence officer. And I'd remembered about Peter Wright because I'm an old journalist. Like you, I can remember the story of Spycatcher in the 1980s. And I thought, no one's really done anything about this since. And I remembered it as being this remarkable combination of utter farce and a very serious attempt to suppress what Britain's intelligence services had been getting up to. So I went back and I began researching that, and it just grew and grew and grew. I managed to unearth documents which had never been seen before because they'd been kept secret for, what are we talking now, 40-something years, which exposed, and these are official documents, I should say, which exposed the British government, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and her senior civil servant as being involved in a deliberate plot to mislead courts around the world, in fact, to commit the criminal offence of perjury. And I know we'll get to that. So with all of that, with all of this information, I thought it's about time to revisit this story and to write the secret history of the Spycatcher affair, and the book is the result.
And for people who don't know, maybe you could talk about Peter Wright and his background, his movement into MI5, and what he was skilled at.
Peter Wright was, as I say in the book, a second-generation boffin. His father had been a very clever innovator in wireless telegraphy in the early part of the 20th century and had worked for MI6. Peter was a clever boy who was brought up on his father's stories, twin stories of science and of spying, and they sort of merged in the young Peter's mind, and he was fascinated by both. His family was blighted by tragedy. His father, Morris, developed alcoholism and lost his job, and the family lost their money, and Peter got taken out of school. He had to go and find a job aged 15 and did all of that. He was due to have gone to Oxbridge, but couldn't go. Finally got enough money together to fund a place at a rural school of rural economy, just before the Second World War. But then the war broke out and the college closed down, so he couldn't do that either. He joined the Royal Naval Scientific Service as essentially a boffin. And during World War II, he and his colleagues developed really innovative workaround techniques to prevent German mines from blowing up British ships. After the war, MI5 approach him and say, will you come and do some unpaid work for us, helping us get up to date with the coming Cold War? And he does that very, very successfully. He earns plaudits from both MI5, that's Britain's domestic intelligence service, and from American intelligence services, because he helped unravel what the Soviets had been up to in their spying, their electronic spying. And so in 1955, he is formally appointed by MI5 as its first ever principal scientific officer. And he set about updating MI5's surveillance technology, which was utterly unfit for purpose in the growing Cold War. And he does that with some success, in fact, a great deal of success. But the more he did that, the more he uncovered another problem. And that problem, which I know we're going to come to, is that all of Britain's efforts against Soviet espionage in the early and mid 1950s had failed. Every single one. Why was that? Well, the answer was that there was a spy, a mole, inside MI5 itself. And eventually Wright was tasked with unearthing who that was.
And he's very kind of a patriotic, anti-communist, loyalist, really, right?
I mean, yeah, Peter Wright was horrifically right-wing. And when I say horrifically, because I'm not, and you know, there's an irony. Peter Wright and I would have disagreed vehemently on politics. Peter was utterly right-wing, and deeply anti-communist, rightly, in my view, anti-communist. But he was primarily an incredibly patriotic man and was profoundly worried by the very real evidence he unearthed, which showed that Soviet spies, Soviet moles, had infiltrated themselves into the British establishment for decades. And that's government, it's the law, it's academia, and it's also within the security service, MI5 itself. And that was what drove him, the need to root these men and women out, because they posed a threat to Britain's national security.
And which was the first one? I know that you address Blunt in the book, but there was the famous Cambridge 5. Which was the first one that kind of defected or was caught?
Well, they didn't defect, nor were they caught. The Cambridge Five was a spy ring which was set up by Anthony Blunt, who was an eminent academic. He was a don at Cambridge. He was an art expert. And he set up a spy ring on behalf of the Soviet Union in the 1930s in Cambridge. And he recruited, amongst others, Guy Burgess. He became very close to Kim Philby. All the big names that everyone's ever heard of are the Ring of Five. But he also branched that out into other universities, and he recruited moles who would betray Britain's secrets throughout universities in Britain. And then as they left university and went into academia, the civil service, the law, politics, they were then in place as moles inside the British establishment.
And what most of those guys that were there was something about them that were they perceived they were anti-fascist, right? At that time in the 30s or something. Is that what was the attraction to engage in this betrayal?
Very much so. I mean, I think you have to remember, I don't remotely condone what those men and women did, but you have to remember the context of the time. In the 1930s, this is the rise of fascism, it's the rise of Nazi Germany, and communism was seen as the only way of defeating the rise of fascism and Nazism. And it was a time when people felt they had to pick sides, and there were only two. There was fascism or there was communism. And Blunt and his recruits picked communism, and they picked Soviet communism as their side and said, we're going to do whatever it takes to help defeat fascism.
And so he was very much involved in that. He had all these kind of upgrades and technology and things like that, but there was not there wasn't a lot of legal oversight for the activities of his position in MI5. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the bizarre thing about MI5 was that it didn't officially exist. Everyone knew it existed. I mean, the world over knew the word MI5, but officially it didn't exist. It had never been established by any law. No, the government didn't exercise any oversight. Parliament certainly didn't exercise any oversight, and nor were they allowed to know what MI5 had been getting up to. And because MI5 didn't officially exist, it meant they could, its officers and its people could and did break the law. As Wright would later put it, he said, we bugged and burgled our way across London while on behalf of the state, while pompous bowler-hatted civil servants pretended to look the other way. And the people they bugged and burgled were obviously Soviet bloc targets, embassies, but also friendly embassies. France, for example, the French embassy was bugged. And business leaders whom MI5 or the right wing inside MI5 viewed as business leaders as being a bit suspicious, they were put under surveillance. So were trade union leaders, so were academics. And beyond that, and this is, I think, where it got really even more serious, is that in time, all this would lead to Peter Wright and a cohort of fellow rogue, if you want, officers inside MI5, formulating a plot to blackmail the sitting Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, and to force him to resign. I mean, that's treason, isn't it?
Yes. And he's deemed as a liberal too, right? So these guys are kind of an enmity against him, right?
Yeah, I mean, Harold Wilson was not remotely left-wing. Harold Wilson was a middle-of-the-road Labour figure, quite good at it. But the idea that he was left-wing or a threat to the security of the country was utter nonsense. He did have some very dodgy friends in business who had contacts, extensive contacts behind the Iron Curtain. But the idea that Harold Wilson posed a threat to the security of the nation was risible. And yet MI5 was able, or this cabal inside MI5 was able to collect files on him, to monitor what he and his friends and associates had been up to, and then Wright and this cabal planned to use those files to blackmail Wilson into resigning. And that's not me saying it. That's what Peter Wright said.
So that's really true. So they really did blackmail him and forced his resignation.
They pulled out of the plot just before it was due to come to fruition. I think reading between the lines and talking to the people I've talked to, MI5's senior management got wind of this and had a word with Wright and said, look, you're going to be in serious trouble if you do that. So they abandoned the plot. But to his dying day, he remained convinced that Harold Wilson was a Soviet spy, and it was nonsense.
He advanced kind of electronic techniques in spying and bugging, but it wasn't all pointed at the Soviet Union, right? I mean, they were doing stuff with that would be considered illegal, even on so-called allies all over that time frame of the 50s. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, it suited the government, the British government, very well indeed to have MI5 on a very long leash. Because it didn't exist, it could go about its business as it saw fit, and that as it saw fit was breaking into private homes, into offices, burgling, stealing documents, photographing documents, putting people under surveillance for no legitimate reason. And the government could simply disavow any knowledge of this because MI5 didn't exist, did it?
Right. Like, it's incredible. But a lot of this was never divulged to the public until he decided to write his memoirs, right?
Most of it remained very firmly under lock and key for decades. In fact, in many cases, prime ministers were deliberately kept in the dark by MI5, which is even more bizarre, if you ask me. It began to all fall apart when Anthony Blunt, the ringleader of the Ring of Five, was going to be exposed and became exposed. And from that point onwards, the house of cards began tumbling.
This kind of one of the central allegations that he made in his book is that this guy Roger Hollis, who was the MI5's director general, no less than that, was a mole. Is that correct? Can you talk
Absolutely
about that?
right. Wright, so we're clear, Peter Wright, inside MI5, he was there. He was appointed their senior spycatcher, if you like. And MI5 said to him, look, we know we've got a problem. We know there are leakages of information. We know there's a mole somewhere in here. We want you to go back through all of the files of all of the old cases and find out what's been going on. And he did that. That was his official job from 1962 onwards. And it absolutely floored him because he found case after case after case in which it was very plain that someone had been spying, had been in contact with known Soviet intelligence agencies, and had been handing them information, and that had been pushed under the rug. It had been hidden. And he asked why. And so before long, an official report by MI5, one of those which I found eventually in the files and which was suppressed for decades, said, yeah, we do have a problem. And the only two people who fit the profile of the mole are the Director General, Sir Roger Hollis, and his deputy, Graham Mitchell. You know, that's an unprecedented and deeply worrying prospect, that the head and deputy head of MI5 are suspected of being Soviet spies. So there is an official investigation, and that official investigation lasts for years. It produces 3 reports. Each one says pretty much the same thing. The Deputy Director General, no, it's not him. He's more likely to be innocent than guilty. Hollis, the Director General, well, this official internal investigation, led by Peter Wright, came to the conclusion 3 times. The case isn't fully proven, they said, but on the basis of 28 separate pieces of solid evidence, there are very real grounds for suspicion. By that time, Hollis, the Director General, under suspicion, had been allowed to retire. He went back to a lovely little cottage in the country with a full pension and apparently, so the rest of the country would think, the gratitude of the nation. The fact that he was a suspected spy was kept secret. And it dragged on and on and on until eventually a final investigation was ordered by the government, which put in its own man, a very senior former civil service servant, and he conducted yet another inquiry. And at the end of that inquiry, that report, which is still secret, but I've got bits of it, came to the conclusion that there was a 20% chance that Sir Roger Hollis, the former head of MI5, had indeed been a Soviet spy.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's really a 1 in 5 chance that your most senior domestic intelligence officer is a Soviet spy. Now, that's very, very worrying, I think. What made it worse is that the government, particularly Margaret Thatcher's government, took the decision to cover this up. And that cover-up is still going on today.
Wow, it's incredible. I mean, so do you think that era's kind of paranoia that I think is even reflected in our intelligence service here in the States is justified all that time, and that Wright's kind of views were correct?
I don't think anything is ever black and white, and certainly not in the murky world of espionage. But there is and was very, very real evidence that what Peter Wright found, and bear in mind he was tasked officially with finding this, was true, that Britain had been, the British establishment had been deeply penetrated by Soviet intelligence, and that this had been covered up. At the same time, you can't ignore the fact that Wright was a very difficult, bumptious sometimes man who occasionally rode roughshod over the niceties of evidence. His argument with all of this is that, yep, maybe, but my job is to give the country the benefit of the doubt, not the suspected spy. I think that's reasonable. I think what makes everything unreasonable is what the British government tried to do to stop him telling the public what had been going on.
Right. So that gets to it. So he retires and then decides to write his memoirs, right? Can you talk about that?
Sure. He retired in 1976 and signed an undertaking as he walked out the door of MI5 saying, "I'll never talk about anything." That's a pretty standard requirement. But he was still deeply worried about the problem of Soviet penetration. And when Margaret Thatcher came into office in 1979, he saw her as a kindred spirit. He saw her as somebody who loathed communism just as much as he did. And he tried to get a dossier of evidence into her hands. he was unable to do so. He was blocked from doing so. So he gets caught up in a couple of simultaneous plots by which the Hollis scandal and the wider problem of Soviet penetration is going to get exposed. And what makes those plots very, very odd is that behind them was Margaret Thatcher and her senior civil servant. They were plotting to have it exposed, but in a way which would not give them any political blowback. And they used Peter Wright, in his words, in a deniable operation. When all of that failed, when everything he tried, including going on television, he gave a lengthy television interview in 1984, when all of that failed to get any honesty from the Prime Minister and from Downing Street, he decided he was going to write his own book. And that book was Spycatcher. And having MI5 and the British government had allowed officers to write books, to go on television, to leak like a sieve when it suited them. But suddenly, when Wright says, I'm going to publish my own memoirs, the British government dropped the hammer on him. And they took out a series of injunctions all across the world to ban his book, Spycatcher.
What in the book? Did they read the book and know what was in there? So that's why
Nope.
they did it first? No, so they didn't.
They had no idea
Yeah.
what was in there. Wright was then living in Tasmania, which is Australia's sleepiest little state.
Right. He's at the bottom of Tasmania.
He's
Like he got as
literally
far
at the
as he
bottom
could
of
get
the
away.
world.
Right.
He'd gone to Australia because MI5 had reneged on the gentleman's agreement it had given him to top up his pension. If you remember, he had not been allowed to transfer his pension, but MI5 said, don't worry, we'll make it up. And they didn't. And he was in dire financial straits when he retired. So he bought some land in Tasmania and he set up a horse stud farm in Tasmania. But because he's in Australia, he's outside the reach of the British government and the British legal system. So that when the British government says, we're going to stop you publishing your memoirs, it hadn't got a cat's chance in hell, because the law simply didn't stretch that far. Despite that, and knowing that, they decided to go ahead and launch this tsunami of litigation in courts in Australia, in New Zealand, in Hong Kong, and in London. And each one of them was doomed. And each one of them was funded by the British taxpayer. That's me, amongst others. And there was no oversight. Thatcher and Armstrong, her cabinet secretary, her most senior civil servant, were just determined to stop Peter Wright. The reason they gave, and as you said, you asked, had they seen the book? No, they'd not seen the book at all when they started this. They had no idea what was in it. There was a very, very odd incident in which Peter Wright's publisher, who was also based in Australia, suddenly found their offices broken into at the time when the British government was desperate to get its hands on the manuscript. Now, who knows who was behind that, but the manuscript wasn't there.
This is like really global news for people who weren't around at that time. It's in the papers all the time, even in the States, which is really interesting.
At the time, when the lawsuits came to court, they came to court first of all in Australia, where Wright was living and where the book had been commissioned by an Australian publisher. And the global press and television, I mean, and we're talking literally from all over the world, flocked to the courthouse in Sydney to watch the proceedings and report on proceedings. And it was on the news and in the news every day, all over the world. It was huge. And it was huge because it was this absurd, quixotic fight by the British government against a former very honourable, if obsessive, spycatcher whom it had employed, who believed that the truth needed to be told. And the press greeted the court proceedings, as a sort of combination or a mixture of a farce that could have been drawn from the pages of a Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera, or even the pages of Alice in Wonderland. It was that bizarre, combined with a very disturbing attack on the public's right to know what its government and intelligence services had been doing. And the British government was castigated all over the world.
Yeah, it's like all the resources of the government against one kind of lone guy. It had a kind of captivating story to it. And it's interesting, too, because you mentioned Sydney, the guy who supposedly did a fantastic job as his barrister in Australia, went on to become the prime minister, right?
Yeah, Wright was very lucky that his publishers found this guy called Malcolm Turnbull, who was then a very successful solicitor advocate, as it was called in Australia. It meant he was both a solicitor, a lawyer, doing paperwork, but he also had the right to appear in court, which is something which didn't happen back home in England. Malcolm Turnbull is an incredibly bright and assiduous lawyer. And he spotted the holes in the government case straight away. And he said, yep, I'll take this on. I'll fight the British government. And I won't charge what other lawyers would charge. I'll keep my fees very, very modest. And as you say, what he did in court utterly destroyed the British government. It's brutal. If you read the transcripts of those court hearings, and I've got all of them, they're both funny and wickedly disturbing at the same time. Partly as a result of that, Malcolm's career as a lawyer went from strength to strength, and eventually he ended up as Prime Minister of Australia. And I've been very lucky to know him and to work with him. And his wife, Lucy, who was also a lawyer and was also on Peter Wright's legal team. And they are a formidable pair. And their work was exceptional.
And that was to his benefit. He made the smart move. He worked for cheap, got free reputational, points or merits or whatever you want to call it by doing that job. So kudos. And one of the other interesting things that I didn't know till I read your book is that Wright had help with another guy who went on to also become well-received, famous, and had celebrity. His name is Paul Greengrass. Can you talk about him?
Yeah. Peter Wright's legal team, Malcolm Turnbull, Lucy Turnbull, and an English lawyer called David Hooper, that's a small team. And what you're dealing with is a vast amount of information and documents. And they needed someone who knew the ins and outs of past cases, past spying scandals. And at that time, there was a man called Paul Greengrass, who was a producer for a British television current affairs program, World in Action, one of the most famous and important programs we've ever produced. Paul had interviewed Peter Wright for Peter's television interview in 1984. And Turnbull saw in Paul Greengrass someone who could be very useful to the defense team. He knew the ins and outs of all of these cases, and he had a brilliant mind. And so he hired Paul Greengrass as part of the defence team. That didn't go down well with the British government at all. They tried every trick in the book to get Greengrass kicked out. Didn't work. Paul, who I've also got to know and admire greatly, went back after the trial, after Wright won his case, and went back into television, became a drama director, and is now one of Hollywood's top movie directors. The Bourne franchise, for example, he's done several of those. He's a brilliant director, but above all, he's a brilliant mind and a deeply good human being.
Yeah, what an interesting arc to come through the Spycatcher story, then to make great movies. I enjoyed those movies about spies, so good on him. So it is such an interesting story, and for people who don't know, then Spycatcher becomes an international bestseller. Everybody wants to read it because of all this consternation, all the conflicts and things like that, right?
Yeah, I mean the legal cases, the main legal cases in Australia, it drags on for a year or two. But in the middle of this, and bear in mind, at this time, British newspapers and British television journalists were under draconian injunctions, stopping them reporting what Wright was alleging. And in fact, several newspaper editors and reporters were threatened with prison. In the middle of all of this, an American publisher buys the rights to Peter Wright's book, Spycatcher, and issues it. And at that point, there's nothing the British government can do to stop it, because you guys have the First Amendment. And it would be impossible to persuade an American court to stop this book being published. And sure enough, it was published in the United States, and then copies went round the world. I bought my copy at an airport or a bookstore in America in 1986 and brought it back into the UK. So did hundreds, if not thousands, of other people. The book arrived in the UK. Bear in mind, it's banned at this point in the UK, and there are these injunctions. And it's sold on the street outside Parliament while Parliament is banned from discussing the case. It is just absurd. Absurdity piles on absurdity in this case. And one of the things that, I had to stop when I found this, doing the research, and I put my head in my hands and I laughed and sobbed in equal measure. So the book's banned in the UK. MPs aren't allowed, members of Parliament aren't allowed to discuss or debate the case. Journalists are under injunction. But a former Prime Minister, who was then still a sitting MP, Ted Heath, former Tory Prime Minister, was sent a copy of the book, the American publication. And he asked whether he would be legally safe to read the book. And the advice he got was, no, it's absolutely not legally safe for you to read the book. However, if you have your housekeeper stand by the fire and read it to you, then you will be safe.
It is absurd. I think you wrote in the book, a tragic comedy and a farce. Like it's like something like out of like a British comedy sketch or something. I don't know.
It's Lewis Carroll. It's Alice in Wonderland. If your viewers and listeners see the book, they will see that right at the front, I've used a quote from a Lewis Carroll nonsense poem, The Hunting of the Snark, in which these weird cast of characters go searching for a possibly mythical beast, but run the risk of being killed themselves. And it's an utterly absurd, nonsensical quest. Well, that was Spycatcher. It was The Hunting of the Snark by the British government and MI5. And I was fortunate enough, I never knew Peter Wright. He died before I began work on this book, a long time before. But I was fortunate to speak with one of his daughters who lived through all of this and supported her father through all of this. And when she saw the quote from The Hunting of the Snark at the front of the book, she got in touch and she said, my father would have loved that because it's absolutely right.
That's a great way to end it. We are at the 40-minute mark, Tim. Is there anything else you'd like to add or anything I missed? I know that the book is out in the US and the UK. The UK, you can get an audiobook. I don't know if Americans could access that.
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that I recorded the audiobook, so I know it's available.
So it's your voice, is that right?
It's my voice,
Awesome.
for good or ill.
So there's a Kindle edition, paperback, hardcover, audiobook. There's American. There's a lot that we did not cover, but there's a lot of details. It's a great story. And I feel like Wright had a lot of integrity. Like, I feel like he wrote the book, with not that much bitterness, but like, I want to really tell my story. Do you get that sense?
Yeah, I mean, the book was partially a confessional for him. I mean, he'd come to the conclusion late in life that what he'd been doing, breaking the law on behalf of the state, was wrong, and that the public, who paid his wages and everybody else's wages, had a right to know what's been going on. And he's an unlikely campaigner for freedom of information because he is very virulently right-wing. But in the end, I think he had seen the light. He is a curious mixture, and I hope the book has done justice to him.
Yeah, again, the full title is To Catch a Spy, How the Spycatcher Affair Brought MI5 in from the Cold. Again, the author's Tim Tate, Tate. I will put a link to his website. Is that the best, if people want to reach out to you, ask you questions, website?
Absolutely. Okay. My email address is on my website, and I will always answer any question that I can.
Awesome. Tim, thanks. Congratulations on the new book, and thanks a lot for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, cool. Stay there.